The first book to come out about Bradley Manning, and he's going to talk about it. So this is Chase Madar.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you so much, Joel Chafee and Veronica Nunn from Brooklyn for Peace and all the other great Brooklyn for Peaceniks here. I really appreciate this, the work you've done to get the word out about this important issue and Bradley Manning and my book. This is the second event you all have put on for me, and I really appreciate it. And thanks also to Jen Northington and Charlene Barker here at Word, and to Fern Diaz, my great publicist at OR Books, who hauled over a dozen copies of my book last night in the cold, and they're available for sale upstairs. I'm not going to read from my book. I'm just going to give a talk for no more than half an hour, then we can open it up to questions and some answers too, maybe. I find that gets a lot more interesting. There's not much value added for me reading from the book, because you all can do that, you know, at your own convenience at home or on the subway or whatever. My book is not a detailed portrait or biography of Bradley Manning, the alleged source for all the best WikiLeaks. Main reason for that is that Bradley Manning has not been talking to any reporters or writers or journalists. He has not been corresponding with any. And this is surely on the advice of his lawyer. They need to be very careful about the message they get out there. And so I was not able to talk with him or his family. My book, rather than a portrait, is a landscape panorama with Bradley Manning as a figure in that landscape. And I tried to sketch out all the important issues that collide in this case, the competing risks of extreme government secrecy versus some degree of transparency and openness, the anguish of whistleblowing in societies that really don't want to hear the truth or important knowledge, the use of solitary confinement pre-trial, whether that's a horrible aberration in the American justice system or whether that is in a way normal in our penal culture, and also the nature of the rules of war and what WikiLeaks has revealed about them. So I'm going to talk about a few things that you've probably heard, a few things, even if you've just been following the story of Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks, that you may have heard is first that, that Manning and WikiLeaks are utopian radicals bent on total transparency. You may have heard that the leaks have uncovered a great many war crimes. And you may have heard that Bradley Manning was treated like an enemy combatant in a cruel aberration of the American justice system. And these three assertions are really mostly false. And they're part of what I talk about in my book, and I'm just going to rattle through them pretty quickly. So first of all, this widespread assertion in the mainstream media that WikiLeaks and Manning are utopian radicals. The conservative reaction, of course, by and large, has been shoot these people, neutralize them, throw them, put them away, whatever. The liberal reaction, on the whole, has been pretty disappointing. I think it's been a reaction mostly of pearl clutching, like, oh, these horrible people. They're putting us on a slippery slope to total transparency, at which point diplomacy and even governance will no longer be possible, and that this is dangerous and a bad thing, maybe well-intentioned, maybe not. But is any of this true? Is this the proper way to look at it? Let's put things in perspective and in proper scale. Last year, Washington classified 92 million documents. That's up from 77 million documents the year before that. What Bradley Manning is alleged to have leaked in terms of classified material is not even 1% of what Washington classified last year. Not even 1%. So I think right there that gives you some indication that instead of a blinding floodlight being shown inside the U.S. government, this is really a very narrow beam, even if it is thousands of documents, thousands of cables and field reports. It's just a very narrow beam. Now, what are the stated goals of WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning? It's been very casually asserted again that they are utopian radicals hell-bent on total transparency. But if you really look at the mission statement of WikiLeaks, the public statements of members of that group, including Julian Assange, you don't find anything of the kind. It's almost shocking how mainstream and even kind of conservative WikiLeaks is in a way. Their mission statement quotes Thomas Jefferson and U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And it's a very far cry from radical groups of the 70s. There's nothing about class struggle or emancipation of women in a radical way, or third world anti-colonial solidarity. There's nothing like that. And and describing WikiLeaks as a group whose ideology fits pretty safely within classical liberalism, I don't mean this as a compliment or as an insult, just as a simple description of what they're all about. But the idea that government should be as transparent as practicable is it's not something that was invented at the DEF CON hacker conference last year or by Julian Assange. It's been around for a very long time. And what WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning have done fits very easily in this tradition. I think instead of seeing WikiLeaks and Manning as radical utopians, it's much more accurate to see them as practical people who are fighting a dystopian degree of extreme government secrecy. Again, 92 million documents were classified last year, and this high degree of classification comes with a lot of severe costs. If you think about the damage done by government secrecy and the distortion and even lies that go with that, you don't have to look very hard in the past 10 years to see the incredible damage that was done. A great many people, even establishment people, I was talking with one former Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration, say, yeah, this is a large part of what got us into Iraq was secrecy, distortion, and lies. And the damage, of course, that we've inflicted on the people of Iraq is enormous. We barely dare to calculate it. It's measured in the hundreds of thousands in civilian casualties. 4,500 American troops killed, and at least another 1,000 military contractors, and at a cost measured in trillions as far as the cost just on the American Treasury. Again, the idea that government should be transparency or you get disaster is not a new thing. I mean, James Madison has a great money line about this. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. Now, in the year 2013, the writings of James Madison should not be sounding like radical slogans, but I'm afraid that they do. And it was just 2 years ago, by the way, that Washington finished declassifying material from the Madison administration. And that is a lag in declassification that we measure in centuries, literally. I mean, over 200 years. It was a code manual from 1809, finally declassified by the National Security Agency in 2011. I mean, we have a severe problem about this, and if you talk to any diplomatic historian, really of any political stripe, they will tell you how frustrating it is to deal with the arbitrary and ridiculous and stubborn overclassification in Washington. And we all depend on historians for a sense of memory And you know, nations, just like individuals who have no sense of memory or what happened before, what they've done before, are not functional entities. You know, I mean, go to Penn Station and look around, and you see what I mean. So this is. I just want to stress that, in spite of all the panic and a fair degree of hysteria about WikiLeaks bringing total transparency. This was a subtitle of a New Yorker profile of Assange a few years ago, The Quest for Total Transparency. There's never been any stated goal by any of the parties on WikiLeaks that they are after total transparency or total anything. This is fundamentally a very practical and very defensive and so far extremely limited endeavor to get some degree of knowledge about what our government is doing. Now, second, that you hear often from supporters of WikiLeaks and even people who are ambivalent that these leaks have uncovered lots of evidence of war crimes. Stay with me now, because this is going somewhere. I think this is surprisingly and counterintuitively not entirely true. How many of you here have seen the helicopter video? It's called collateralmurder.com. Most of you have seen it. I mean, what happens there is plainly an atrocity. You see and you hear this Apache gunship from 1.5 miles in the sky blowing away civilians. They're laughing about it. They're treating it like a video game, it seems. And they kill over a dozen people. And there were a couple guys in that group who were armed. There had been sniper fire in that area, but of course does not come even close to justifying an atrocity where they shoot down a group of people, civilians, and then when a van comes to pick up the wounded, they shoot up the van too and kill the driver and the passenger and severely wound 3 children who were in the van. So it's certainly shocking, and it's shocking also to learn about torture in Iraq after the U.S. occupation. In December of 2005, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Peter Pace, publicly contradicted on stage somewhere the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. And General Pace said, "It is the duty of every U.S. soldier to stop torture wherever they see it." This was after the scandal of Abu Ghraib, and there was some sensitivity that this is horrible, it looks horrible, it is horrible. But we know, thanks to the WikiLeaks revelations, about something called Fragmentary Order 242, issued by the Department of Defense, and that is an express policy of not interfering with torture when it is practiced by the Iraqi authorities under U.S. occupation. And the U.S. military kept copious documentation of torture being practiced and all kinds of gruesome details by Iraqi authorities on suspected members of the insurgency. People just rounded up. But this was still happening constantly under the watchful eye of American soldiers. So the truly shocking thing to me as an attorney, and it's shocking in a different way, is to learn that the consensus view among international lawyers and specialists in the laws of armed conflict is that both what happened in the helicopter video, the shooting up of those crowd of mostly civilians from 1.5 miles in the sky, and also allowing torture and not doing anything about it, even though the U.S. is there in full military occupation, is legal under the laws of armed conflict. That it is not technically, and I think technically is the only way to look at law, really, it is not a war crime. And this is kind of a meta-revelation from these leaks, to learn that the laws of war are incredibly permissive. For every restriction on the use of lethal force in the laws of armed conflict, there are 10 instances of granting permission to the use of armed deadly force. And that the real purpose of the laws of armed conflict, it's not to restrict or to soften violence, but really to legalize it and facilitate it and organize it in some ways. And I think this is an important point to make because a great many people, especially liberals and moderates, have this bizarre faith in the laws of war as being capable of civilizing war, and this bizarre faith that war is something that's really amenable to regulation, like, you know, the trucking industry or food additives. And you know, there's certain things that are, of course, clear violation of the laws of war, but it is important to note just how permissive the laws of war are, and that so many things that are plainly atrocities, atrocity not being a legal term, but just a vernacular term, are completely kosher and allowed in the laws of war. And Julian Assange was supposedly shocked by this when he brought the video of the collateral murder helicopter shootout to a few scholars and experts, and they all said, well, I hate to tell you, but that's actually okay, or there's law on both sides of the issue. And this is why neither Human Rights Watch, nor Amnesty International, nor Human Rights First, the big three in the English-speaking world of human rights groups, offered any kind of condemnation when that video came out, which may be surprising to a lot of people. Now, the laws of war aren't totally useless all the time. They can have a real role when the two parties at war are somewhat evenly matched or equivalent or kind of commensurable and share a common mindset, mentality. But in asymmetric wars, when you have non-state actors, whether it's Filipino insurgents in 1899 or Comanche warriors or Hamas, these non-state actors really don't have any legal status to speak of, as the laws of war are commonly understood and interpreted and practiced by the world's big, powerful militaries, which of course have a stronger hand than anyone in writing the regulations that supposedly control them. So third, Bradley Manning has been treated like an enemy combatant, in that the 11 months of solitary confinement that he endured right after being captured demonstrates that the war on terror is now coming home and being inflicted on American soldiers and American citizens. How true is this? I mean, this has been one of the most scandalous things about this whole story is the solitary confinement. First 2 months in Kuwait mostly, and then 9 months at a Quantico Marine Corps brig, until pressure, most of it international, but some of it national here in the U.S., forced the Obama administration to shift him into the medium security population at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Does this mark some turning point? One Fox News commentator called it KGB tactics. This is their in-house libertarian, Andrew Napolitano. There's some truth in that, because Manning's treatment really does resemble the way Soviet dissidents were confined and tortured in psychiatric prisons called psikushkas, which were psychiatric hospitals crossed with jails, and Soviet dissidents were pumped to the gills with psychoactive drugs. And the assumption is that dissidents and whistleblowers and naysayers must be crazy, so they must be cured of that in the course of their confinement. Others have claimed that this is the war on terror going home. Manning's father compared his son's treatment to what has been going on in Guantanamo. And people are always looking for all these foreign reference points to describe just how horrible Bradley Manning's treatment is. And, there's some accuracy to these. But what's being lost here, or somewhat repressed, is the fact that Manning's treatment is really all-American in a way. That we use long-term solitary confinement all the time here. It's a regular part of our penal landscape. We have about 20,000 prisoners doing long-term solitary, being slowly driven insane in the federal system, and between 50 and 70,000 more in the state penal system. And pre-trial solitary confinement, it's not the norm. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens often enough if people are considered dangerous, if they can't make bail. And so even that is not so uncommon. We've been treating Muslim Americans particularly harshly, who have endured treatment very similar to Bradley Manning. There was one Brooklynite, former Brooklyn College student, whose crime was allowing an informant to store ponchos and wool socks in his apartment in London. The informant had told him that this was material he was going to bring to an Al-Qaeda training camp. And this kid, he was just in his early 20s, he got a 15-year sentence after doing 3 years of solitary confinement. So this forces a larger question about the war on terror and the harsh tactics, the torture that's been used. Where does it come from? I mean, it's tempting to say, oh, we've just lost our heads in wartime. That's a very common, I would call it an excuse or a justification or an explanation, that the torture at Abu Ghraib and the torture that happened early on at Guantanamo and still goes on at Bagram prison in Afghanistan, this is really a horrible aberration of American values. I'm not so sure that it is. I think that it's much more accurately described, I mean it's not identical, but it is much more accurately seen as an extension of the domestic penal system and our penal culture, that we are just exporting to more visible venues, more exotic venues, where both American intellectuals and the rest of the world somehow feel more comfortable criticizing and condemning it there. Even though in many ways it is quite the same as the way we treat prisoners here. This is a point that's been made by others, by Bob Herbert, the former New York Times columnist, by law professor James Foreman Jr., and by many of the intellectuals at the great blog Black Agenda Report, like Margaret Kimberly and Glenn Ford. It's not surprising that most of the intellectuals making this point are black Americans who have more awareness and consciousness of that this country has been at war for a while, and the war on crime, the war on drugs, where the militarized nature of this isn't really that much of a metaphor, and that we have just extended this war elsewhere. And that's something that I think is very important. Even as we condemn Bradley Manning, I'm certainly not making any kind of excuse for the treatment of Manning in saying that it's somewhat normal in our incredibly dysfunctional, harsh, and nasty domestic penal and criminal justice system. Okay, so those are 3 points that I make in the book. I'm going to make a 4th one right now as my free gift to you all for coming out here in the snow. One thing that drives me nuts about the national discussion of Bradley Manning is the refusal to understand this young Army private's motives for leaking these things. This is someone who is neck deep in the worst foreign policy disaster since Vietnam. He chose to go there, which is a choice that I think should in this case be respected. No one forced him to go, help deal with this mess, but he enlisted. And he found out firsthand what a disaster this war was, and where many people, including many liberals who supported the war, saying that it would bring human rights to Iraq and it would end the despotic cruelty of the Saddam Hussein regime, he found firsthand that there is still torture, that people are still being rounded up for distributing pamphlets non-violently about financial corruption in the Iraqi government. That's the incident that really changed his mind, apparently. And that the U.S. occupied forces weren't doing anything about it. Manning's motives are very clearly stated in the chat logs between himself and the hacker turned informant who turned Manning into the authorities. And Manning said that he's leaking these things, or he has leaked these things because, quote, I want people to see the truth regardless of who they are, because without information you cannot make informed decisions as a public. And he hoped that the revelations would lead to, hopefully, worldwide discussion, debates, and reforms. And it's just very hard for me to see what is so objectionable about this motive. And what is so hard to comprehend about it? Very few people think the Iraq War was a success. Very few people outside of Washington. Why is it so hard to recognize that a soldier who was there, seeing this calamity firsthand, wanted to get the word out? But it's just shocking how many people, and I'm not talking about the Fox News crews, but many liberals just cannot comprehend this or refuse to look at this. Just yesterday I was reading on the Daily Beast, Alex Gibney, who's a big deal liberal filmmaker, made a good movie about Enron, the smartest guys in the room, made a movie about Iraq, and he's made a movie that will be released soon. It just screened at Sundance. I think it's called This Man Steals Secrets, but it's all about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and Bradley Manning. And I was, as I say, I was pretty pissed off about what Gibney wrote about Bradley Manning and his motives. Here's what he wrote. The initial presentation of the story was that Bradley Manning was a pure political figure like a Daniel Ellsberg. I don't think that's a sufficient explanation of why he did what he did. I think he was alienated. He was in agony personally over a number of issues. He was lonely and very needy, and I think he had an identity crisis. He had this idea that he was in the wrong body and wanted to become a woman, and these issues are not just prurient. I think it raises big issues about who whistleblowers are, because they are alienated people who don't get along with people around them, which motivates them to do what they do. To understand Bradley and all his humanity seemed terribly important to this film. So this is the typical thing that happens to whistleblowers in many societies, that when you speak out, people are so eager to marginalize and psychologize it and reduce it to mental health things or to sexuality things, but just cannot quite come to grips with the political motive that is out there in the open. I'm not going to read any of my own work, but a blogger that I like had a great response to Gibney's bullshit. A blogger named Jacob Bachrock, who had a blog for a while called Who is Ayaz? And this is what he writes. I'm going to read this, because that's what blogs are for. You print them out and then read them aloud to other people. That's the great, technological advance. Whenever and wherever a human does something of which the New York Times is not certain it approves, the gray lady turns to psychology, like an 11th grader with a collection of Capote stories and a looming term paper deadline. Gay computer nerd loser is the pathology, and revealed government secrets is how it presents clinically. Then he goes on to say, well, it was unfair of me to single out the gray lady. The old girl isn't the only one. All media must now report that Manning suffered from crippling gender dysmorphia and, all caps, gay sex confusion, the two leading causes of opposing U.S. military action abroad. A confusing syndrome for which there is currently no known cure nor effective prophylaxis. So you find documentary filmmaker, and I submit to you, by the way, this is the single most insufferable noun phrase modifier in the Queen's tongue, Alex Gibney, in the course of discussing his new WikiLeaks documentary, proposing, again, to understand Bradley and all his humanity, you need to grok that he was a fucking weirdo who wanted to cut off his own Johnson. It's only lately occurred to me that straights must experience their own sexuality as an absolutely crippling psychic nightmare. A torturous, imprisoning dream from which the dreamer cannot awake. Nothing else explains their readiness, their eagerness to discover in gays or trans people or whomever a dark well of self-hatred and disgust which can only be overcome by the eventual transformations by habituation of their families into models of tolerance and understanding and the cheerful evolution of the president himself into an oratorical Stonewall name checker. In the Manning-Lamo chat logs, that's the chat logs between Manning and the informant who turned him in, Manning says matter-of-factly that it was, quote, easy to figure out that he was gay, although he took a lot of shit for it in school and from his family. And though he agonizes about gender transition, his agony is practical. I wish it were as simple as, hey, go transition, he says. His problem, such as it is that he revealed that he was trans to his military employers, and he is stranded in limbo, awaiting out-processing. Manning's own self-accounting of his dissent, what we know of it is, quote, purely political, like Daniel Ellsberg, and unrelated to his desire to transition. Conflating his sex and gender with his dissenting acts is pure projection on the part of condescending heteros who can't imagine a queer person as anything other than a protean, inchoate shitpile of doubt and contradiction whose only outlet is adolescent acting out. I think that's a very accurate description of the way so many people, especially, and I find this so depressing, so many people, intellectuals and media, oriented towards the Democratic Party. Gibney's terribly important desire to understand Bradley and all his humanity reduces Manning to the crudest gay caricature, young, confused, weak-willed, emotional. My God, practically, well, that's what the blogger wrote with it. I just can't stress enough that this is a ridiculous interpretation, misrepresentation of the motives of this whistleblower. Now, there are about 850,000 Americans with top-secret security clearance, and that clearly indicates that number, just how ridiculous the whole concept of top-secret security clearance is. How secret is something if 850,000 people, about more than the population of Washington, D.C., have access to it. But it's without a doubt that thousands of these 850,000 people with top-secret security clearance are, lesbian, gay, bisexual, maybe even transgender. Now, to say that this is the reason for leaking just defies logic and evidence. Again, it's a willful suppression of the very clear political motives that are here. And people can disagree about the impact of the leaks or the wisdom of the leaks, but I'm confused by the confusion over the motive, which is just so clear and simple and out there. The Obama administration has proceeded with 6 uses of the Espionage Act of 1917 to prosecute 6 domestic leakers and whistleblowers, which is twice as many as all previous administrations combined.
You moved. I was definitely in the way. I was very outspoken against the war, and I was subsequently arrested on the Patriot Act and locked up in prison on Carswell Air Force Base while the government rewrote the history books.